Hello, this is Dwayne Wright, and in this presentation we're going to cover the most basics of using waterfall project management practices in software development. You may know quite a bit about this topic, and I'm hoping that perhaps I may introduce a few new concepts that you weren't aware of. And by the same token, I would love to hear from you on things that I could polish up on. So let's get started, shall we? So, waterfall project management used in a software project is normally going to be used for very large software development projects, not the smaller ones. And it is used mostly to mitigate the impact of risk. So, this is a technique for analyzing risk called the House of Pain. And if you do a Google search for that, you'll find a lot of different takes on it, and this is mine. So along the bottom, we're talking about the tech that is going to be used to meet our goals. And it's not just how complex the tech is. It's also an alignment to the resources that you have and how accustomed they are to that tech and how well they can pivot or adapt to using that tech. So even if it's a relatively older tech and known, if you don't have the people and the resources to handle it, you can be more into the risky or even dangerous zone. Complexly, you could have a very tough tech, very, very challenging tech, but if you've got the right team and resources, it could be downward from dangerous into risky, challenging, or maybe even considered a standard project. And we have the same sort of thing across the vertical axis, which would be the requirements. Again, a big project is chances are it's going to have big requirements. And some of the challenges you have there is not capturing requirements, not having a process, not having a great business analyst, having people who don't respect requirements. Any of those types of things can move you up into a dangerous zone. But again, you can have a ton of requirements, but if you have a great BA or great BA team, you can reduce that down to being more of a tough, challenging, or maybe even standard. Now, you may think that the intersection between these two challenges of the technology and the requirements would decide how you are here. If you're risky here and you're tough here, you'd be over in this particular area. This may be true, but this diagram looks at it a different way. It decides what goes in this particular area by the people. So another factor you have is the number of people in this project and all the different things that comes along with having a lot of people on a project. Sometimes it's a good thing, but normally if you continue to add stakeholders to a particular project, it's going to become more complex. So as you can see that if you have a really tough piece of tech that's hard to understand as far as not only implementing but what its benefits are, and you have a tough time getting requirements, and you have a bunch of different stakeholders and diversity in those stakeholders and challenging in getting a shared understanding with those stakeholders, you can be closer to the will fail area on these big projects. And Waterfall is designed to help mitigate that risk. So let's see how that applies at a high level to a waterfall phase gate system. So waterfall is a sequential process. So the idea is that you would finish one sequence and meet a set of qualifying criteria before you can go into the next phase. So very often the very first phase is a concept. So you're doing the most basic documentation, presentations to get approval to go to the very next phase, which would be your plan. So if the concept is not good enough to expend the resources and time to plan it, then the concept would end at that point in time or be mothballed, if you will, until it can be elaborated further. When you get approval to go into planning, then your documentations, your presentations, your justification efforts are all about the plan. And generally, the plan will be about schedule and cost and resource allocation. And again, you're wanting to show enough of this to go into the next phase, which is detailed requirements. So, to a degree, this is a back and forth. It's kind of hard to do a concise plan until you have requirements. But you have to have a good enough plan to expend the resources to do a deep dive into your software requirements. So your presentation, your documentations, and your justification efforts up to that point will be the concept, the plans, and the requirements for the package. When you get approval, you usually go into designs. These can be both artistic designs and architectural designs for the software product itself. And again, there will be a approval process for you to go into the meat of the project, which is your construction, your development. So at this point in time, you're not just jumping into development. You've spent a considerable amount of time and resources in planning, requirements gathering, and architectural and visual designs. So your level of unknowns when you go into development should be reduced. So then after you get through your development phase and you show that you have a working concept, if you will, you go into quality assurance. So, and then you may end up cycling back and forth and doing some different planning, some different requirements, some different designs, and different construction, which you can do when you're in QA. It depends on how it's set up. But a QA is the final gut check. And then finally, you have your deployment criteria, the number of people that says, yeah, it's okay to go ahead and bring this out. Again, when you're dealing with Waterfall, you're normally dealing with big projects. So these come to be very important overall. So each one of these phases has a common process. It may vary a little bit from phase to phase, but there is a underlying structure that is normally undertaken, and let's just take a quick look at that. So you have a foundation. In the concept phase, you're starting from scratch, but in all the other phases, you're building upon the progress you had made of the phases before it. Then you normally, while you're in this phase, you're creating some sort of justification document or documents. And this is so that you can get approval to go to the next phase. And this is normally done in a approval meeting, a change control board, that type of thing. Sometimes these can be done virtually via email, but normally you have a bunch of people in a room and they will be looking at your documentation and then looking at your presentation, and they will decide that something is going to happen. And what is going to happen? Well, one of the variations is they say, you know what, it looks good to us, go on to the next phase. They could say, you know what, looking at what you've done so far, this project is just something we are not going to do at this time. They could kill it outright, or they could hit the big pause button and say, bring it back to us in the next quarter, next year, that type of thing. Another thing they'll come back to you and say, okay, we've looked at it and we still like the project, but we don't think your justification is what we need. We still have questions. We want you to update the documentation and then come back to us with your revised version of your justification. And another one, and this is more of an outlier, they could come back and say your entire work in this particular phase is not good enough, or we want you to revert back to a previous phase. And these are all things that can happen when you go to that board. And so when you go to that board, you do want to make sure that you're prepared as best as possible. So once again, this process will happen in most of the phases. So if you have a setup like this with concepts, plans, requirements, designs, construction, development, quality assurance, and deployment, then you'll do this little cycle that I just explained in the concept phase, And this will normally be spearheaded by the project sponsor. And in the planning phase, this will normally be your point of contact will be a project manager. In the requirements phase, it'll normally be an analyst. In the design phase, it will normally be a, a lead of some sort, some technical lead. You may have an analyst do those types of things, but normally it's someone in a lead. It's more of a facilitation effort to get that documentation together. And then when you're in the construction phase, you normally have a lead developer that will do that. It's possible that you'll have a project manager or an analyst have a lot of say inside of the constructor development phase. But if everything works possibly at the high level, you'll have a lead developer. You could also have a scrum master. It's also possible to do an agile method inside of the construction phase. And then in quality assurance, you'll normally have a QA lead. And then in the deployment phase, it'll go back to a project manager, or in some cases, what we would call an integration manager if you're updating a system inside of a workplace, not something that's customer facing deployment. Now we're going to talk about the cone of uncertainty. The first time I was exposed to this was a presentation that did a call out for the Software Project Survival Guide by Steve McConnell. This is a different take on it, my take, and let's just go ahead and get into it. As the top, you can see we have our different phases. And at the concept phase, the things that we're not sure about could be in big groups, but overall, it's going to have X amount of size. Now, as we do those justification forms and go through those processes to go through the phase gate, what happens is we learn more about our endeavor and our uncertainty changes. In most cases, it will shrink. You may have a new element introduced, things that at the time you didn't know that you didn't know, and you've actually done more discovery in the areas as you did your plan, and you have an overall less amount of uncertainty. Now, as you go into the analysis phase, your requirements, you're looking at the plans, and some whole areas of uncertainty may vanish. And it could also be that you just say, you know what, that's out of scope as we did our requirements. And so we'll circle back to that if need to be in a later version of the project. Then as your technical designs, your UI, that type of thing start coming together, your uncertainty gets even less. And this probably isn't a fair representation. You're still probably going to have some different colors, but you'll see where I'm going with this. And then as you're developing, your uncertainty is starting to reduce quite a bit. There may be some new things come up, but overall, it's less. And then when you get into testing, it gets even smaller. And then when you go into deployment, you should have a very manageable set of uncertainties. So if we take a look at that, mapping out the tops and bottoms, and then removing the insides, you see we have something that looks like a cone. And the idea is that as you go through these phases, as you start doing that justification, as you're having those meetings, as you're going through the meat of the phase gate process, your uncertainty goes down, and so should your risk. So we went through that pretty quick, mostly because I wanted to get under the 15-minute time limit for YouTube. But I do look forward to getting any kind of feedback you may have, and please email that to me at dwayne@thepracticalba.com. Thanks again.